I just first want to start with territorial acknowledgement. So please join me in acknowledging that we are on the unceded traditional lands of, well, I will mention as many as I can here: the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish Coast Salish, the Kikite, and the Kikite nations. And just to acknowledge that we are on about 95% of British Columbia is on unceded territory, and this is where we work and where we learn and where we share. And of course, so this theme is so important to this element of land and territory and the honoring of our land. So thank you everyone for coming. Also just wanted to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded. So just so that you know that. Nothing, just if you don't want your comment to be seen, you can always just message it to me directly. Although, you know, it's a friendly, welcoming space. So first, this is the second in the Climate Emergency Speaker Series. And Seeds of Change is, of course, on the subject of seeds of change and climate change. And we have our two local poets, Renee Saklikar and Kim Trainor. So Kim, you're going to go first, I take it. So just to introduce Kim, she is the granddaughter of an Irish banjo player, I love that, and a Polish faller who worked in logging camps around Port Alberni in the 1930s. So her book Lady was a finalist in the 2019 Raymond Souster Award. She teaches at Douglas College, lives in Vancouver, the ancestral unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So Kim, take it away, and I know that you have some films to show, so very excited. Welcome.
Great, thank you, Ivana. So I will offer my own territorial acknowledgement because I am actually at Douglas College at the David Lamb campus on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Coquitlam First Nation. And very grateful to be here and reading to you tonight. Well, playing my films for you tonight. So when Renee first approached me about doing a reading together, I was really excited by this idea because fortuitously we've both been working on seeds and thinking about seeds in relation to climate change. And we're both working on somewhat long-term projects, I think, as well. For my part, I've been thinking a lot about wildfires and seeds, and the link for me that I've been thinking about is Sauragini. So this is the requirement of heat or fire to germinate seeds. So the most current manuscript I've been working on, the first section consists of poems about wildfires. And then the second section, which is still in some ways evolving or developing, is called Seeds. And it's this long sequence that, and each poem is a seed and thinks about forms of resistance, survival, emergence in the context of the sixth mass extinction and climate change. And then, so each poem as a seed, and I'm using seeds somewhat metaphorically as well. So not just seeds, but things that can be thought of as having seed-like properties. So it could be a human-made tool or an organism that's sort of driven by its DNA and its environment to adapt and respond to existential threat. And maybe providing models for us somewhat confused humans at the moment. I've written seeds about the tiny houses, which was inspired by the tiny house warrior group in the xว์məthkվəy territory. Another one about Elysia chlorotica, which is this amazing sea slug that has learned how to photosynthesize, and many others. So partly with this project, I've begun to develop films, poetry films. So I've created collage-like films, and my brilliant colleague Hazel Fairbairn, who also teaches at the college, has done the musical or sound score. So she's composed and performed them for me, which is a wonderful experience, but maybe I can talk about that later. So the first one I'm going to show you is called SARS-CoV-2 or SARS-CoV-2. I think it goes without saying, it's about the virion that causes COVID, and we're somewhat familiar with it by now. And it might seem like a strange choice, but viruses are pretty amazing. They're myriad, they exist all over the earth. And then, they're streaming constantly through the air, and they're incredibly adept at evolving quickly. They do something called horizontal gene transfer, and they're really great at hacking their hosts. So I will play this one first. Between the first and the second wave they'd warned will come by fall, we hiked Hollyburn to Blue Gentian Lake. First time in the forest, after months of sheltering in place, surfacing through blue-green tree light. Western hemlock, sword fern, pink twists of salmonberry, then buds and unfurled leaves, as we climbed past rusted litter of needles, second growth, and a skid road. Back to an earlier season, before clear cuts, before the virus, to ancient cedars and snow. Trying to see again all the little things and what I can't see. Microscopic tardigrade, zoid, diatom, amoeba, alga, virion. This organism at the edge of life, 50 nanometers in diameter, slip of RNA and capsid, that has slowed the world slip sideways from pangolin to human, or escaped from a virology lab in Wuhan. Riboviria orthonavirI pasuaviricota pisonvircetis nidoviralis coronaviridae beta coronavirus sarbecovirus SARS-CoV-2. With an affinity to the receptor angiotensin converting enzyme 2, ACE2, on human cells. In the electron micrograph, it looks like a child's crayon drawing of a flower, or maybe a sea monster, red-violet circled by goldenrod and studded with little turquoise spikes. There are 10 million viruses in a teaspoon of seawater. Virions stream around the earth, above the weather, all rain down 800 million on every square meter, rain down RNA, rain DNA. Oh, little virions, oh diatoms, oh tardigrades, oh mosses, oh virion of the horizontal gene transfer, reservoir of genetic diversity, driver of evolution, O virion of the last universal common ancestor. As we climbed, I touched the knitted blanket of mosses grown on every ancient cedar along the pass edge. I didn't have words to identify each kind, or even to know if it was moss or liverwort, each expressing a genetic language in green structures. Gametophyte, rhizoid, feathered or slender, phyllids, archegonia, and antheridia, the filamentous seta of sporophytes, Oregon leaf moss, juniper haircap, hoary rock, pipe cleaner, sphagnum, snow. Suddenly, more snow as we ascended to Blue Gentian, more and more. The lake still frozen, winter still. But we cannot go back. We are an emergent, complex state, evolving. Cro-Magnon sewing needles and antler-tipped spears, ochre and hematite drawings of the spirits of animals, smartphones and Gore-Tex and bicycles, penicillin, CRISPR, our technologies, our alphabets and poems, our rituals, the stories we tell of our future. We can interrupt the usual signals. We can't go back, but we can go sideways. We can change. So that was SARS-CoV-2. The next little film I want to show you was really a joy to make. I enjoyed it so much. It's called Tardigrade. And tardigrades are these little tiny microscopic creatures. They're known sometimes as water bears or moss piglets. And they have this amazing ability to endure very harsh conditions. They go into a tuned state when they're stressed. It's a form of hibernation, and they can simply wait out the horrible conditions until they're better, until the conditions are better. So this particular poem was inspired by this little pinch of tardigrades that were added to a payload of an Israeli rocket that was meant to land on the moon, but it crashed by mistake. And this was in 2019. And the rocket ship was called Bereshit, which is the opening phrase from the book of Genesis in the beginning. Just have to find it. Analog 1. These instructions contain 4 analog entries comprised of this set of instructions, the first 3 verses of Genesis, a human child's line drawing of a stick figure, a primer to a fraction of the Earth's 7,111 languages, followed by a brief statement on existential threats and archival cultures, which has been handwritten in a small notebook, then translated into binary code and printed by lasers, followed by haiku. This poem can be read by the naked eye. Analog 2. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim va'et ha'aretz. V'ha'aretz hayata tohu v'vohu. V'choshech al pnei tehom. V'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. Vayomer Elohim or vayehi or. Brief statement on existential threats and archival cultures, written in a small notebook and then translated into digital code and printed by lasers. First, there were handprints outlined in reverse by mixing a paste of red ochre and spit and blowing this through a hollowed-out bone. Then stitched leather pouches to hold seeds, etc., then scrolls, pyramids, and codices. These have all lasted millennia and were analog before it was cool to be analog. Then came microfiche on plastic sheets that will probably degrade or melt in about 100 years, or in the event of a catastrophic event. In the meantime, along came digital formats, zeros and ones, punched into IBM cards by female key punchers like my mother circa 1974.
then microchips and thumb drives, information coded in synthetic DNA or grafted onto the DNA of living plants, such as Nicotiana benthamiana, common tobacco, that can, in theory, grow whole libraries from seeds. Imagine walking through a park that is actually a library, every plant, flower, and shrub full of archived information. Then back to analog again, with optical nanolithography, letters the size of a bacillus bacterium etched onto glass, and then filigreed with atoms of nickel. Layers and layers of this stuck together with epoxy resin, holding the DNA and hair follicles of a venture capitalist, as well as a pinch of tardigrades, who also, in their dormant state, have their cells replaced by a protein that resembles glass. And all of this shot to the moon on the Beresheet rocket, which crashed 11th April 2019. Probably the tardigrades survived.
So I like to think of those tardigrades still up there on the moon somewhere, waiting to be revived. And the last film I'm going to show you is called The Beautiful Cell. And it's inspired by a quote from the philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset, and he wrote an essay in aesthetics by way of a preface. This was in 1914. And he talks in this essay about the thing in itself, like what it is like to be some other thing or being. And in particular, he's interested in the role of metaphor. And he calls metaphor the beautiful cell. And I was so struck by that beautiful description of metaphor. And he writes, just as there is an eye John Doe, there is also an eye red, an eye water, and an eye star. Everything from a point of view within itself is an eye. But of course, this I, to some extent, is always unknowable. So I was thinking about the role of metaphor and helping us to experience what it might like to be another, and that this might, in fact, be another useful seed for us to take into the future. So this one is called The Beautiful Cell. No, not that one. I'll try again. We will try for The Beautiful Cell. As cute as the tardigrades are. Here we go. When I'm feeling a little down, I just watch a tardigrade video on YouTube. Always makes me feel better. I recommend it. Here we go.
There is the same difference between a pain that someone tells me about and a pain that I feel as there is between the red that I see and the being red of this red leather box. Being red is for it what hurting is for me. The extremely tiny, mostly transparent sea angel, Cleone limacina, is actually a slug. It ranges in size from 1.2 to 3 centimeters and preys on sea butterflies. Every angel is terrified. Just as there is an eye John Doe, there is also an eye red, an eye water, and an eye star. Everything from a point of view within itself is an eye. Limacina helicina, or sea butterfly, actually a snail, swims to a depth of 3,718 meters. Its shells are dissolving due to ocean acidification. The sea sälil, love child of slugs and jellyfish, aka sea walnut, blob, jelly ball, goo of stealth, jelly bean of the sea, forms eerie luminous chains and may play a significant role in carbon sequestration. The aesthetic object is inwardness as such. It is each thing as I. Aurelia aurita, moon jelly, is not a fish. Looks like the moon when light pours through. A sea gooseberry drifts like the barred spiral galaxy NGC 1398, 65 million light years from Earth. The glasswing butterfly is known in Spanish as espejitos, little mirrors. A chaotic nanostructure makes its wings clearer than glass. The essence of glass lies in its serving as a passage to other objects. Its nature is not to be itself, but other things. Look through the transparent belly of a glass frog, little window into its body. This example of the glass can help us understand intellectually what, with perfect and simple evidence, is given us in art, an object with the double condition of being transparent and of having what is seen through it be itself, not something else. Glass octopus, glass catfish. With a hand lens, you can see its beating heart. This object that can be seen through itself, this aesthetic object, is found in elementary form in metaphor. Metaphor is the elementary aesthetic object, the beautiful cell. I, sea angel, I, moon jelly, I, self, I, frog, I, glass.
Thank you for letting me share my poetry films with you. And I will pass the talking stick back to you, Ivana.
Well, I think we can all, I almost need a moment to collect myself. That was amazingly powerful. And already I've collected several questions, so I'm sure we will have a lovely and fruitful discussion on those. But so yes, absolutely wonderful, wonderful work, and so inspiring. But let's turn to Renee now, and that way we can have an even more fruitful discussion, because obviously with her work, which is also amazing. And let me just see again what things in philosophy. Oh, okay, wonderful. Yeah, there's so many great comments in the chat, so I've been trying to keep up with those. But please also make sure that you send in your questions once we open it up for that. But Renee Sauragini Saklikar is a poet and a lawyer who lives in Vancouver on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. She is the author of 4 amazing books, including the groundbreaking poetry book, Children of Air India, about the bombing of Air India Flight 182, which won, of course, the Canadian Authors Association Poetry Prize. She's also the co-author with Dr. Mark Winston of the poetry and essay collection, Listening to the Bees. Yes, winner of the 2019 Gold Medal Independent Publishers Award, Environment Ecology. She is currently working on book 2 of the, correct me if this is wrong, but Thought J Bop. Did I get that right? Yay! Series, an amazing epic fantasy and verse about climate change, climate justice, and global inequality. The first book of the series is Brahma and the Beggar Boy, about a time-traveling female locksmith helping seed savers, resistors, and orphans against the rule of the evil consortium. So we will share the link so that you can take a look at that and look at it yourselves and enjoy it. But I turn over the mic now to Renee, and thank you so much for joining us. So.
What an honor to be here, grateful and excited to move into our discussion after I read just a few poems from this long poem. Brilliant introduction. Thank you. Thank you, Kim, for your stunning work. So one evening, after the dry, but still in the wet, in an old house in an abandoned village, on the outskirts of Perimeter, in the place they call Pacifica, Brahma and the Beggar Boy find fragments of an ancient text in an oak box. Hunched over scraps of parchment and broken computer disks, they blow the dust off a cover, and so our story begins. The 5 catastrophes. By water, the soul, tsunami, seepage, cascading, eroded. By fire, the eyes, scorched, singed, blasted, burned to melt. By earth, the body, trembling, split, collapsed on knees, tumbled, crushed. By wind, the voice, blown. Sifting syllables, winnowed circumference, made square by 4, ripped, torn, worn, howl. Captured at the gates of one of the last autumn portals. Chained, we sang before, is also a place. Transport planes to buses, freight trains, shunting, railway tracks, bombed, rebuilt with old iron, dry pine cones falling, unrelenting and sad. Baghdad to Paris, east to west, reserve armies of labor, social unrest. The poorest families, sick with fever, those who stood at the back of the line shared crusts of bread, telling tales of the before. Resistance song. At the year's midnight, we sighed, heads bent to Perimeter, where oracles foretold colony collapse. Our aunties saving mason bees, small finds in handmade glass jars. Wildfires in November, ash mixed with ice, our skin dry, cracked, scalps covered in lice, gray skies unending, snow drought extending, sallow leaves withering, their spines snapped in two. At Tower Juniper, rentalsmen stood ready to accept payment for shelter. We bartered our daughters, we sold our boys, Wi-Fi on ration, gas, our androids, no toys, toxic alert on high. We ached for green. Who would have thought of us standing unseen? Overheard by seed savers. Mind those drones, they'll break your bones. Hide and sweep, duck and swerve, watch us learn. These raindrops burn. Village women gossip to the seed savers about Brahma, the locksmith, at Tower Juniper. Our bread set to rise, but falling flat. Oven door banging, unhinged and broken. All that heat lost. At Cedar Cottage, our milk soured, the butter wouldn't set, and then a black cat run under the ladder, wood cracked. At Hemlock Place, that dog next door wouldn't stop barking. Look, our keys broken inside their locks, stuck. Well, consortium said they'd send someone. Later in unison, they tell rentalsmen, her fingers brown and strong, smooth leather satchel, her black braid shining, pippin file, drill, tweezers, lock, ghost key pulled one by one, gleaming in the sun. She worked fast, all the while her lips moving. Let all evil die and the good endure. The beggar boy meets Brahma's grandmother. When Brahma brought the boy to grandmother, they both laughed. Not another one to feed. Oh well, said grandmother, shaking her head. Come with me, boy. You can help carry seeds. One night they walked past that carved portal gate. Grandmother took the boy's hand and shook kernels. Red dawn, sequoia swirls, hard, spindle-shaped. Seeds as thin as oat flakes fluttered down. With the seeds, a set of tales found in that old oak box, written on parchment fragments, read aloud by Brahma to the beggar boy, the notes of the beekeeper's daughter. They burnt all our hives. They killed my mother. With her last breath, she made me write these notes down. She taught us edge magic, twilight and dusk, dawn or the hours just before, tilted entry points, lines, horizon opening. It were the beekeeper's daughter who left word about seed savers and the followers of Auntie Maria. They left this note. We who would walk perimeter, those crows, a chorus under feathers, fluffed. Outside, rentalsmen, honey locust, bare stands, the thinnest trunks, by order of consortium, roots, shallow, so as not to disturb. In our pockets, remnants, true felted, small quilt squares for masks. Auntie Maria of Tyne and Church, all the streets now gone. Fissured earth, snow a poison, yellowed edges, the shanty dogs who would run to tear what she held and rubbed, sewn circles piece by piece. Oh, patch and mend. Outside perimeter, no matter when, not enough tear gas to stop the screaming. Something about the last harvest, said Auntie Maria. In those days, she carried always the book at her hip. My Garmin, she called it, band. All the beggar boys called out, Auntie M. All those sword girls smiled and said, come fight with us for favor. Come lose your limbs. No guards of the gate ever dared laugh. In this way, distractions to allow for seed savers smuggling cherished when gathering 9 bark in star-shaped hairs, imported leaves, Physocarpus spirea, city opening along one seam, hardhack, small beaked, she'd tramp under shrubs, black hawthorn, doubly serrate, mid-rib above, deep green. She kept seeds close, tucked to her chest. Auntie Maria told us, search for the dove tree, follow pocket ghosts, 3 children chanted. Help us journey, save us from the toothed margins, no bombs, forbidden, glabrous on top, downy below, male, dual male to female, big bracts, the base, one long as the other. Creamy white, we asked, together sang, ovate, pendulous. Auntie Maria said, never count on flowers anymore. This is what was told, handed down petal to petal. Large droops, woody crested seed, red bloom. Auntie Maria told us to save seeds. She told us to search for the scientists. We found the scientist, ragged, trembling hands to give data. They counted 11 honey locusts, branches thickened with moss, 6 bird nests, omens, forget-me-not, long-tongued the distance between. Last seen, the bees, Cowitzia amabilis, signals of distress. The glossa with terminal flabellum. We found a seed saver. She's unnamed, marginal, and soon to be struck from the record. Alone in her condo, out by the Goodbye River, woman chairbound, reaching for cardamom, saffron threads mixed with street harvests. Meta sequoia imports now banned, also brown, hands also trembling. All of us taken to stand witness at the science trials. Although not permitted, we smuggled seeds, asters, yellow mustard, shrubby veronica, white clover, covert and still able to transmit purple toadflax, sage, and calendula. Perimeter assigned a schedule when the rain fell, leaves. When the rain fell, the wet holes burned. And at first light, they made us watch 1,000 suns collide. All of us joined with Auntie Maria and scientists on the run. We hid that data in abandoned shacks. First, again, we measured for bees. Then they died out. Then we collected rain droplets, burning skin, no snow on the mountains, bridges torn down. The shelter sat on the flooded prairie where the wind bit sharp, a crick joint of land outside rows of. There, before forest fire clearances, tidewater riddled, soaked, and under a bit of higher ground. There huddled a heifer, her calf ruffled brown hide, pressed close, a young goat, a fawn, 3 hybrid gazelles. We stared at these animals never seen in the before. We knew then we'd not last long, past fire, past flood, the dry, the wet, things lost like this. Found decades later, a hologram plate in capitals. We told ourselves we knew this day would come. And then later a second plate. Transmission intermittent and fading. After that first bomb, they tried to help us. Surveillance drones sent self-care packages. Air quality and running water tests proved inconclusive. We restarted though. One day a mother ran out to the park. Look, she said, I'm just tired of all this. Little by little, we turned things back on. Ladies from the Patch and Men Brigade laughed. Each time you work your faucet, look twice. Keep your buckets handy, rainwater counts. We learned to dig shelters, hoarded supplies. Those Patch and Men's mocked us. These chains will end supply. They laughed and coughed. Consortium restored our wireless, so at least our thumbs could scroll androids. And then thank you so much.
Oh my goodness. Oh, our thumbs scrolled and oh my goodness. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much. Yes, the applause. So again, I'm a little speechless, even though I'm the moderator, so I should not be. But thank you so much. That was, yes, we do need an applause button. I agree, Elizabeth. I prepared some questions, but I want to open it up to those watching, the participants and everyone. So if either one of you want to ask each other questions, or okay, how are other people using emojis? That doesn't count as a question, so we will. I'm not sure, actually. I think it's a little, I don't know, something. So I would just like to see either if Kim, if you have a question for Renee, or Renee for Kim, we can start there and then I can open it up.
I definitely have questions for Kim, but
you had more time to process.
You go first, Kim.
Well, I know this is sort of part of a much longer project you're thinking of, and I'm just curious to know, I mean, I love projects that expand and they incorporate all these different elements of what's happening in the world today. And I guess I'm curious about your process, like how are you, because it's very much a narrative work, and then you're also working with almost like cli-fi and sci-fi and poetry, and there are all these cool different genres that you're blending together. And what is that process that you're using?
Thank you for the question, and truly inspired, I think, Kim, by your work and the commonalities in our work. So this will be similar to your question, will be similar to my question, but I've been working on this project. It's an epic fantasy in verse, trying to reclaim the epic for women of color, for persons who want to inhabit a different space for the epic. And folks have told me, you know, it is surreal the way I started this 10 years ago and started reading research, I think in ways perhaps similar to Kim. And my imagination has seemingly dovetailed now in a surreal way with the very events that are happening. So early on in the pandemic, I heard people saying this from the before, and I'd always sort of used that as a demarcation, like maybe 7, 8 years ago, I started this idea of, well, how am I going to alert readers to time passing in this big project? So it has been really interesting. I do a lot of research. People always often ask me, you know, what poetry are you reading? And I try and read a lot. I have the great privilege of curating. For instance, I curated Kim lunch poems at SFU. I know Liz has read for us and many others. So I'm reading poetry, but for this project, which is happening kind of at the side of my desk because it's been going on for so long, I just released book 1, Brahma and the Beggar Boy, of which I read little selected fragments. I read a lot of science. I read all these massive climate change reports. I read about water tables. I read about migration. So it has been a really strange journey that the last 2 years, the pandemic has just solidified a lot of what I was sort of just imagining. And now it's like me sitting here typing, looking over my shoulder, and then me sitting here typing, wearing a mask. And, you know, the Patch and Mend Brigade, these aunties who sew these masks, they existed prior to the pandemic. And one of the most searing memories I have of our early pandemic days was when, you know, it was all starting and we were so frightened. I mean, we're still frightened, but it was all just the no vaccines. And I can remember turning to my husband, who's kind of, you know, major involved with the whole health response, and saying, is this it? Is this it? Is this what's happening in my book? Is it happening now? I was just so terrified that the really, really, really bad stuff, where in my world, there are no vaccines. And so the seed savers and people who save things like glass and learn how to make things like soap, you cannot kill a virus with anything if you don't have vaccines, except safe social distancing, masks, sunlight, and soap. We must not lose the ability to hoard glass and non-plastics and to make soap. Trust the aunties on that. So that's a long way of saying that I'm living it and researching it and writing it and looking over my shoulder. And that sort of leads me to my question for Kim. When I watch you take language and science, and with Hazel, visual and poetry and music, and you interweave layers, can you talk to us a bit about your process?
Sure. I'm fascinated by your answer to my question, because it's similar to what I'm doing. There's so much research. So I choose a seed, and then I start with a stack of papers that I've taken from all over the place. So popular and academic, and as you say, climate change reports. And I've written a whole seed on bees, actually. So and looking at the Vespa orientalis, actually a wasp, the oriental wasp, it's called colloquially, which has created this band of photosynthetic material, so it can actually photosynthesize as well. And thinking about how there are these interesting adaptations in the natural world. But you're talking about the need to sort of save and collect and reuse. Makes me think of the right to repair. Yeah. And I'm also super interested in seeds are very much about that, and saving sort of local land races, like those sort of seeds that are developed for a very particular microclimate. And that's where they grow best. And they've been developed to sustain and thrive in those environments. And we're losing those at such a vast stage, just as we are languages, right? You asked, so that's one thing that occurs to me. And thinking about things like saving glass and the knowledge of how to make glass, we don't know how to make anything that we use today, right? Not just like you pick up a cell phone today, we'd have no idea how to begin to recreate such a technology in some sort of post-apocalypse. And the materials that would be required, just how to make glass. How does one make glass? Which reminds me, there's this fabulous book called The Knowledge, and he goes through it chapter by chapter. Here's how you make glass. Here's how you smelt iron. Here's how you create an antibiotic, that kind of thing, which we would need to go back to if we lost what we currently have. And you get that sense with like the pandemic, when the whole world shut down and we couldn't, the supply chain stopped and people were freaking out, and the shopping malls were emptied of basic things. People were buying cans of beans. People who do not eat beans were buying all the beans off the shelves. But we don't know how to can things anymore, or even make jam. So I'm with you with all of that, totally, 100%. And I love your suggestion about the epic sort of reclaiming it for a more a feminine or female space, and for persons of color and people who are disadvantaged in other kinds of ways, or whose voices have not been heard. And it makes me think of even Boland, who writes a poem about that. She writes a poem to the antibiotic, I think. So thinking about those really sort of domestic or I guess domestic, or things that are often thought to be in the female sphere, like repairing, stitching, sewing, collecting seeds, nurturing them, all those kinds of things that are so crucial and really important skills. And they're incredibly noble, but they're small. But you don't get those epics because it's not about the spear being thrown from one person through another person and so on. And don't get me wrong, the Iliad is an amazing long poem for its descriptions, but it's valorizing a very particular Western value. So that's still not answering your question though, but I so once the poem has been written, I sort of sit down and I just stitch together all these different images. So it is kind of like a collage, patchwork. And some of the images I've shot myself, and then some are just little fragments I've taken from here and there, from YouTube, sort of scavenging, I suppose, or salvaging, and then putting them through different frames, stitching them together. And then when I have a piece that I'm pretty happy with, and I've done the voice track, I send it to Hazel. And I noticed Hazel in the chat. So I know you're there. Hi, Hazel. You're amazing. And it's very sort of freeing, because I just send it to Hazel and she does amazing, brilliant things. And I hardly have to say anything, because she just kind of takes it where she wants to go. And then she'll send it back to me and say, what do you think of this? And it's almost always something exactly that I wouldn't have thought of doing, but I really love it. And she does such fine details, like in the Tardigrade film, where I was reading that little section in Hebrew from Genesis. There's if you listen to the sounds underneath it, she's actually using Morse code. So there's all these very fine details, and you'd have to listen quite a few times to pick up on that. So maybe I'll say, can you make it sound a little bit more this here or this there? Or she'll say, can you add some more images? But it's been wonderful as a poet. You probably know this too, but it's wonderful to work with someone else for a change and have more of a collaborative experience, because often as a poet, you have your notebook and you're scribbling away and you're in a room or you're somewhere, and it's not until you actually go to a reading or something that you reach out to other people. So it's great to have that collaboration. And thank you again, Hazel. Shout out to Hazel.
Yes, and Hazel, if you want to join in here, please let us know. I'm just trying to track some of these amazing questions as well. From Nefertiti, Renee, did you intentionally use gazellas? Because when you read it aloud, it sounds like gazals and green to mean both nature and money. So let's first get that answered in terms of, did you mean it in that double way?
It's wonderful when readers and listeners bring their own perspective. I don't know. I don't, when I'm actually in the moment of composing, because it's all in verse. So you'll hear the rhyme, and hopefully underneath you'll hear some of the metrical things and the epic forms of poetry. There's ballads and sonnets and madrigals and all kinds of things. That's sort of the technical backstory thing that I just hope the reader enjoys. So to answer that question, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, I love that the listener is seeing that and experiencing that. But yeah. I don't really think of meaning a great deal. I do all this research, and then in the act of composition, it's about the language and the sound and the images. Yeah, absolutely. Exactly what this listener has done. That the meaning, I leave that to the gods and to the reader, the listener. You know.
Right.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And just for Kim, same little clip there. Do you have any plans to lead a park as library walks?
That's interesting. I'm actually working with a colleague at KPU right now, who's an artist, and we're planning some series of guided walks with the Hulitsum First Nation in Delta. That's coming, hopefully in the summer. And we're not quite sure what it will be like, but we're thinking of the title. I forget.
Reserve that. No. Leave it.
Sorry, the title is not I forget. It's I forget. But it might be called Walk Quietly, I think. But we're wanting it to be a guided walk where you would stop at various places and thinking about the layering of place and voice and history going back thousands and thousands of years, both in terms of peoples, but also the land, the organisms, the rocks as well.
Wonderful.
So yes, actually, I am planning something like that.
There we go. Yay. Wonderful. And from James Gifford, you have, there's a question about away from sci-fi, fantasy. Even though, so for Renee, for fantasy, thought of as a conservative or even reactionary genre, which of course, that's very much debatable, as you say, but how do you see your epic fantasy engendering in a meaningful way? And how would you define the genre?
Wow, trust James to have deep and fabulous questions. So I'll just try and kind of deal with a few of them. But before I do that, I think Liz Baczynski had a wonderful, I don't know, with my lighting, I'm in a very dark office and I'm using one of these rings. So I don't know if you can see it, but she asked me to hold up the book, which I love to do because it's produced so beautifully.
It is.
And maybe if you go online, I'll just type in for Liz and everyone. You'll see a lot about how things look if you go to the website for the series. The series is called The Heart of This Journey Bears All Patterns. And it has this acronym based on that phrase, just taking the first letters of each of those words, thoughtjbap.com. And I love the way it sounds vaguely South Asian and it's so English, right? The Heart of This Journey Bears All Patterns. It's a beautifully produced book and it is all in verse, Liz, and it has little diagrams. And so, yeah, you can't really see it, but the text is laid out in stanzas, couplets, quatrains. There's 105 sonnets, et cetera, et cetera. So going to, and thank you so much. And thank you for bringing your class and for being here, Liz, such a great poet. So James, also a fabulous poet and writer. Regarding fantasy, I'm very much a student of fantasy. As a child of color, loving and reading fantasy, I never saw myself, of course, reflected in those heroes, or as Kim so brilliantly said, I was brought up in a family that adored Virgil and Homer and the Odyssey, but it was such a male perspective that I just internalized like many of us do. And I loved it. Mort d'Arthur, Robin Hood, Brahma, my heroine, the time-traveling lost ones. She's very much a Robin Hood, right? She works on contract for consortium and joins up with these seed savers and these aunties. So I think what I'm trying to do with a lot of the tropes of fantasy is just incorporate them and reclaim them for my own purposes. And they're really basic. Like I would love if, 100 years from now, the muses and the gods willing and history, and if we survive, that there might be some grandchildren of the people here who would still be reading my work because it's an epic that speaks to them, and with the female heroines and with these resourceful, humble people, who, many of whom are marginalized, but are somehow surviving and care deeply for planet Earth. And that somehow we've saved enough seeds and we have reclaimed the right of repair, which I'm fascinated with. And just so you know, my character Brahma does Morse code. So there you go. I think Jung said it's a great river of subconsciousness. To move on to the next part of James' excellent question, I don't know that I have enough learning like James might, or perhaps Ivana has, about the genre of fantasy and how the current literature views it. I have experienced it, as I said, as very conservative, very male, from Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and a very small c Catholic, of course. And certainly my intent is to open that up, whether it's Milton and Paradise Lost, which has greatly influenced this book, Brahma and the Beggar Boy, to include all the things we've talked about. And it is interesting, the tension between the epic and fantasy. And this is where I think poetry comes in. Hopefully that closes the loop on the fascinating question. Whereas I don't see that I am blending anything. I feel I am just reclaiming the epic and epic forms in poetry. And maybe poetry is this bridge. So maybe, I don't want to sound definitive. I'm just a poet practicing my long poem trade, but
well, James is saying that fantasy needs you, so there you go. You have the open
if you get a chance, everybody who might be interested in fantasy, James has a new book coming out, and I think I need to take a course with you, James, on fantasy, but I'll leave it at that. And I'm just, again, so excited by everything Kim said. Like, I just feel man, I want to collaborate with you and Hazel.
Well, I'm also, I mean, in terms of fantasy, and now this is not my forte in terms of fantasy, so maybe James, you can help me, but there is, you know, where Octavia Butler came in and reclaimed that space, and there seems to be that that trajectory with the saving of some genetic code, and for you it was the seeds and the beekeeper, and so there is that overlap, and I think that takes me to a question that I'm wondering for both of you, seeds, but both of you also mentioned parchment, and so and in this regard, then also I think the seeds as an imprint of our past and of our customs, of our knowledge, as parchment as well. And so Renee, you're kind of working in the area of parchment. Kim, you're also bringing in film, which, as we know, when it first was created, was a female dominated form. So like much of oral history. So I'm wondering sort of how the seeds kind of loop in or kind of weave into both of your works, and whether you see, well, I'll leave it at that. So there's my commentary and question.
Well, I can say I've been, I think since my first collection, which was called Karyotype, I've been interested in DNA. And I think of you know, seeds similarly as a kind of blueprint, right? Just as DNA, the karyotype, the sort of human genome, as a kind of language that is expressed in different ways in the environment. And so with tardigrade, for example, there's definitely various allusions to different forms of preserving information and carrying them into the future. You know, and so when Renee talks about wanting to create an epic or reclaim the epic and hoping it might be read or continued through time, the poem, I mean, especially the lyric poem, is probably one of the earliest, if not the earliest, pretty much universal form that is created by humans. And I'm also interested in evolutionary theory, which has been thinking about the sort of adaptive function of narrative, but also questioning what might be the adaptive function of the lyric poem, which I'm interested in. And of course, Renee working in epic, that's very much a narrative form, but with lyrical elements. So I suppose the fascination for me is how it's almost analogous, I suppose, seeds, language, and in poetry, it often has been very much oral, and that might be the link to the film. And of course, there's all those different technologies which carry that knowledge forward, but the problem ultimately becomes readers. If your poems are written on microfiche and they require a microfiche reader to read, and electricity, we're going to be hooped at some point in the future, which makes me think of James Lovelock, actually, who says, you know, probably the best gift we might give to future generations would be a really well-written book of knowledge that carries information like wash your hands, here's how you make glass, and here's how you preserve seeds and grow things. And that it should be written in books that are on really strong paper with waterproof inks that can be read by the future without the need for a special Kindle or electricity or whatever it might be. The codex is one of my seeds, actually. So I'll end my comment there, but the idea that the codex has had a pretty good run so far. We don't know how long microfiche will last, and it tends to degrade pretty quickly as well.
Absolutely. So the language that resonates. So, and I have to thank you for introducing me to the Blossing study on lyrical poetry, and the resonance of language and the resonance of that knowledge that we cannot speak after the fact, so that there is some knowledge that is retained in the sound itself.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Renee, did you want to comment on the seeds? seeds of
Yes. And
change, the parchment. I love that, where
yeah.
you were comparing the seeds and the parchment as being saved together.
Yeah. Well, and what you just said about language, and I think of rhyme as a seed. And so the ballad and the transmission of the epic through its first form, through the oral code of seed languages, seed rhymes. And it's a new dark ages, I have imagined. The goddess willing, we will not get to that, but I don't know, my friends. So in the world of Brahma and the Beggar Boy and the subsequent parts of the books of the epic that I'm working on, it's a new dark ages. And the parchment is an old scroll that Brahma and the Beggar Boy find, of course, in this old oak box. But it's the grandmas and the aunties. So picking up on what Kim said so beautifully, the small sciences, the small domestic crafts of making, the right of repair that consortium bans outright. You saw in that last fragment, I sewed together for this reading because it's such a long epic. The first book is over 300 pages. So those of you who might be following along, you might be going, wait a second, I took a string of different poems and strung them together for this reading, for the purpose of this reading, to bring out, to amplify some of these ideas that are embedded in the epic. And so the parchment, if you think of where does parchment come from, from the hides of animals and the scraping and the craft involved in vellum and parchment, and it tends to last a really long time. And in my epic, one of the first things I had to grapple with was, if all these disasters happened, there would be no electricity, or it would be hoarded and rationed. So there are these ration cards. And this past week, when the government announced gas rationing, my husband texted me and said, it's your poem again. But, everything that Kim is saying, I feel that she and I are on this continuum. It's very exciting. And that I think those of us who are tilling the work of language as seed that Kim is doing so beautifully and thoughtfully, I guess I'm doing that as well. And Ivana, your questions are so gorgeous that the carefulness of your listening, so that it's very much about let all evil die and the good endure, which is this absolutist, non-nihilistic motto of the hero of the whole saga, Brahma. She exists all through the books. I'm not quite sure how many they're going to be. We'll see if I can last. But right now I'm working on book 2. And, this is her motto. And it's the opposite of kind of our hip, transitory, nihilistic, easy come, easy go, take it or leave it. She is a traditionalist in the sense that she's a time traveling woman of color, warrior maker, intent on helping seed saving against the evil mega corporate consortium. But her motto is let all evil die and the good endure. And so these ideas of what endures, I think, is very much about seeds. And the other thing I wanted to say about seeds and parchment and language was that, just to circle back again to this idea of rhyme, I wanted to resuscitate rhyme for global equity and migrant, immigrant, marginalized peoples. I wanted to re-inhabit the rhyme form. So you will have heard, there's the Patch and Men Brigade, these domestic women, they use a lot of rhyme, very sly, sort of anti-establishment rhymes. And I think you see that, as soon as stuff happens on the internet or, from left and right, whatever it is, you'll see these slogans and rhymes and advertising. People naturally go to rhyme. And I do see rhyme as a seed,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, every form, that's the way that we pass on the form through the best form of memory is through rhyme. And I just want to make sure, Sarah Windenage, what were the names of the poems? Which ones are you referring to just specifically? Because I want to make sure that you get that information, but which were you talking about, Kim's or Renee's, or just let us know and we'll get you those both. Okay. So I think, Kim, your work on did you want to just mention the works that you mentioned earlier?
Oh, sure. Well, the films were called, Tardigrade and The Beautiful Cell, and It's late. I have a
your
very
work
small
lady.
memory.
Lady. We can post it perhaps. Anyway,
Yes.
Tardigrade, the beautiful cell.
The beautiful cell, like CELL. Yeah. 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 And then yeah.
Exactly.
And SARS-CoV-2. That was what it was. So
excellent.
I'll take that. Yeah. I believe they've all been published in either literary journals or ecological journals. But if you go to my website, actually, I have links where possible. So you could go there. It's just my name.
And that's the same for Renee, I believe. All your works are listed there. Okay, excellent. Just does anyone have another question that you'd like to ask? I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I think I'm not sure how much time we have, and I don't want to keep everyone here, but I guess also, this idea of metaphor, which the beautiful cell as metaphor, and then what Renee was saying in terms of sorry, now I've lost my place because I've been writing it down in like 5 different pages, so I'll pull it all together at some point. But also I wanted to say for both of you that we've been talking about women and the writing of, and yes, the Hebrew, yes, Nefertiti. Kim, where and how did you learn Hebrew?
I don't know Hebrew fluently at all, but I have a coach. So my partner for the past 5 years, who happens to be a rabbi, so that has helped. So I had some coaching so I could pronounce Bereshit correctly. I know a few blessings and things like that.
Right. And I guess in terms of also what we were talking about, the lyric Anthropocene, so human, but also anti-humanist. Can't wrap my mind around the lyric, but so working through that work, I guess. James, did you want to go further with that question, or can I actually? I'm just going to ask in terms of. I'm just going to step in and ask for both of you. You're talking about the small lives. Let's put that in quotation marks. The small lives of what women preserve, the seeds, the knowledge, the everyday. But do you also along with this see the working class, or for instance, you were talking about the epic and the great battles, but of course for those great battles to take place you have to have the ironsmith and everyone that sort of prepares these big battles. And so with the whatchamacallit, in your work, Renee, the consortium as trying to control both language and distribution of knowledge, and just thinking then when we were saying about if we lose our power, of course most of us are just going to be standing there with our phones, wandering around aimlessly. So is it also an element of class struggle in your works, and where does that come in terms of basically just the general theme? So I just wanted to.
Oh, well, I'm thrilled to be asked that. I don't think I have ever been asked that. And if I may, I will, just because it's getting late and yes. I'm feeling I'm less and less articulate, but I want to savor every question. It's such an honor to be asked that. Indeed, before I just read this short quote from Meredith Quartermain on my work, it's very Dickens. So another influence on this whole reimagining of this dystopian Pacifica is Dickens, and this idea of all the characters in my epic, from the great to the small, right? From Brahma, who's she will learn eventually in the saga, not this book, but in upcoming books, that she's a demigod, but the beggar boy. So it's Brahma and the beggar boy. So this Dickensian idea that from the top of society, from the hierarchy to the very bottom, and upturning that and subverting it through all these different means that we've been talking about, is very much a class analysis. And I felt very deeply the more I read about climate justice, not just climate emergency. And this is where I have profound admiration for the people who are bringing this series. Thank you. And for Kim herself. Thank you, Kim, for your work. I feel she really gets it about climate justice, and that for too long, the clarion calls to action for climate change have been dominated by white males of privilege, and that people of color who bear so much the first brunt, or working people of any color, we're often on the front lines of any climate change or any pandemic, and we're not represented. And I wanted this work to represent. And I'll just read what I was delighted to see Meredith Quartermain, the publisher, asked her to blurb this book. And she writes, Brahma and the Beggar Boy takes us into the near future apocalyptic world on an odyssey of our time. Like Melville's great whaling story, Saklikar's tale rivets us with mind-blowing insights. Oh, well, that's very nice. But the part I wanted to get into was into the destructive forces at work right now in our capitalist world and how we might resist and overcome them. So it's very much on my mind that I think in terms of this construct perimeter, who's outside and who's inside. And so most of the speaking voices are very much from those on the outside, not all, but yeah.
Yeah,
I wonder
giving
if Kim,
voice to those echoes of the voices that are echoing below all the dominant speak. Yeah, wonderful. Kim, did you want to respond to that?
No, only I appreciate very much Renee's comments. And I mean, Ivana and I talk often about working class, coming from working class backgrounds. And certainly with my students right now, I work on themes of climate justice and specifically the impacts on Indigenous communities in British Columbia. And we see what's happening right now with Wet'suwet'en, for example. It's often those who are least able to combat the consortium in a sense, who are seeing the immediate impacts on their land and their resources, which they see as something necessarily part of a long culture and tradition, being taken and being mined without consent. So it's certainly a really important part of our attempts as the climate committee at the college, the union committee, to consider as well. And we're hoping to continue to develop that with our future speaker series. And we're working on another speaker series next term, focusing on Fairy Creek, for example. So that's to come in the future. And I would just say, just regarding James's comment about lyric, we might have to hash this out at another time. But I would just say very briefly that I would describe my poetry sort of alt lyric, like ALT, alt lyric. But I think lyric is the whipping girl of poetry in some ways, or has been. And I will argue that later.
Absolutely. Yes, I know.
I will be standing in arms with you, pacifist arms with my fingers and my stitching. Yeah. And I think James is being a bit of a provocateur there.
Oh, wonderful. Yes.
I just wanted to thank Ivana and Kim so much for your foresight and your questions. And I wanted to say, I've been meaning to tell Kim this. I'm going to tell you, whenever I read your bio, I love it so much. And that evocation of your working class roots, like that's straight out of my epic. You know, you're a hero in my epic just for that bio. That's the sort of woman populating my imagination.
Cool. Well, I'm happy to populate it.
That's wonderful. And just if I can give a caveat in terms of to pull all of this hopefully together, not really, but we don't want to pull it all together. We want to let this keep going, resonating out. But just I'm thinking of, I have two elderly parents, and the things that they keep remembering are the little rhymes that they learned in elementary school way back in the day. And I just think about that, how those little rhymes return along with music, little songs that they learned. And I think that is maybe a good analogy to end with in terms of what is the role of rhyme and poetry in terms of our human memory, and the fact that it does imprint itself in there quite deeply, and kind of changes who we are. So the work that you're doing is so incredibly important, but also so incredibly beautiful. So I want to just thank you also for including me in this, letting me babble on with my questions, and letting me, try to get as many of the questions. I'm sorry if I didn't get to any of them. Please let us know if you do have a question for any of our panelists. And otherwise, I just want to say thank you so much. And yeah, it was wonderful. And yes, our brains are spinning now, which is exactly what they should be doing. They're dancing with thought and delight. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivana. And thank you, Renee. It's been a delight to read with you.
Everything that you both have said.
And so this will be recorded and available, I think, in the future for people to access, which is wonderful. So yes, thank you, Renee, so much. And I hope to meet you someday soon.
Ditto, ditto. Let's do something again. And big shout out to all these fabulous comments, the audience, the students. And thank you, Kim, for your openness. Really, thank you.
You too.
Thanks, everyone. All right, bye. And till next time.
Till next time.
Till next time.